Welcome to Emergency Capitalism. I've got the critical theory professor Fabio Vighi with me today, as always, on this podcast and show. Welcome back. It's been too long. We need to get on the stick and do these regularly because it's been so long that many things have happened to confirm your thesis about emergency capitalism since we last spoke. I went to the conventions in the United States, and we're making a documentary about American politics and the election. And I've been so deep into the horse race and trying to figure out what this election means. I didn't pay any attention at all to, for instance, the elections in Germany.
Yeah.
So you brought up before I started recording that you wanted to talk about that.
We can talk about that. We can talk about a number of things that have happened during this summer. Obviously, I've taken some time off myself, but the media sort of bombardment is always there, and there's always a narrative to talk about. So there's obviously the big narrative also here. It's the horse race, I think you called it, the selection, as I call it, very often, rather than the election, the U.S. election. Something that struck me about that is that I see a kind of convergence between Trump and Kamala Harris on a number of issues, particularly with regard to the economy. They both seem to want lower rates, and they both seem to be very much into the crypto space. So we got the crypto king and the crypto queen. Apparently, that's what I've heard, which is interesting because it kind of confirms to me that it is ultimately a selection, and the selectees have already been briefed to an extent by the Wall Street sort of guys, and they know that they have to keep to a certain narrative about the economy. They can't really. So I was struck by that, but obviously you followed it much more closely, and I'm sure you got much more to say about that. As far as
it's very confusing, and I'll just say this about it. In 2016, Trump was elected despite the entire establishment opposing him on all sides, right? He didn't get I think he got one newspaper endorsement out of all the newspapers in the United States. It was a surprise that he got elected. It's apparently even to him. And he represented the insane part of the Republican Party. We interviewed Charlie Sykes and Joe Walsh at the counter convention at the Republican convention, where they talked about how in 2012 there had been a number of candidates who had moments where they looked like they might become the nominee, candidates who the establishment had not vetted and did not want. Luckily, in the end, it was Romney, but Charlie Sykes said they should have noticed then that they were losing control of the Republican Party. Today, at the Republican convention, the people who were surrounding the convention, the fans of Trump, were optimistic. They had a sense that maybe it reminded me of kind of like a old Ronald Reagan campaign ad. Morning in America, we can overcome this malaise. We can reinvest in American exceptionalism. But they were all kind of not quite ready for prime time types, rough and tumble, flyover country type people. And yet they were excited for the prospects for America. And then when I went to the Democratic convention, it was very much an upper, or at least upper middle class affair. People were there professionally. They were very much harder to interview. They didn't want to be talking to the likes of me. And they had places to be. So it does seem to me like and when it comes to the base, like the people who are excited for Trump and the people who are excited for Kamala Harris, they're different kinds of people. But then when you look at the policies, I do see a lot of continuity between the two parties, and on levels that I'm very uncomfortable with. Like, for instance, I don't expect, if Trump is elected, which I think at the moment it doesn't look like he will be. That he will discontinue, for instance, the surveillance programs and the censorship apparatus, despite the fact that RFK Jr. has endorsed him, and RFK Jr. is one of the main targets of censorship over the last few years. But I did not think about crypto as anything to take seriously. I just thought, oh, well, Trump is trying to excite his base, and they like crypto,
right?
Even though, like that, I thought of it in the same way as like he's also selling trading cards and commemorative plates.
It's like launching a product, a publicity stunt or something, But I think Kamala is doing the same thing. She's not sort of she's also promising more or less the same support of the crypto space, Bitcoin, etc. So maybe they are talking to a specific part of the electorate that they want to hoodwink, as it were.
Well, what do you think crypto represents? Are we going to be in a future where, rather than there being a lot of cryptocurrencies that are independent, we're going to have like a state-run electronic currency?
Yeah, this is definitely coming. I think I think there's awareness that the system is slowly but surely cracking at the seams, is breaking at the seams, and so they're preparing a different monetary system to bring in. The most obvious one, the one that people talk about, and it has been researched and experimented in a number of countries already, is the central bank digital currency. So money would become digital and centralized. Obviously, the crypto thing is the opposite. So it's in the sense that it's digital, it's still a digital asset, but it's not centralized, it's decentralized. So it kind of sells that dream of a free use of money and kind of very libertarian approach to digital money. The risk is that at some point it might get centralized regardless, controlled centrally regardless, right? And obviously the fact that it's digital makes it easier to do it, to centralize it. So I think that they know that something is about to give. We don't know when exactly, but at some point, sure. The other thing that they're doing, and that's what the banks are doing as well, they're stockpiling gold. They are buying a lot of gold, which is normally a sign that they're aware that the financial system itself is not necessarily strong any longer. That gold does precisely that. It's a it's a hedge against inflation, against financial crash, and so on and so forth. So the fact that they are now openly even advising their customers to buy gold suggests that there's awareness, a widespread awareness that the system is in a bad place, as it were. Even the financial system, and here we can talk about that also. I mean, it's for the US. I think it's about monetary control. It's about trying to hold on to the dollar as the global reserve as much as possible, because that's the key weapon, economic weapon of the United States of America. Obviously, monetary control on the global currency, and that is coming under threat now by de-dollarization, as we see it happening with the BRICS, particularly China, and that, I think, is a driver for a lot that is going on in the world today. The attempt to delay this process of de-dollarization that would take us to a multipolar order, as they call it. So the dollar would lose at least some of its hegemony in monetary terms in the world, and that I think is a problem for the US elites. They really recognize that, and I wonder if you think that there will be any major differences in foreign policy between Trump and Harris, because obviously on paper there should be, but I'm not sure whether in actual fact there will be.
Well, my feeling is that, from what I've heard from Trump, is that he will. It really depends on whether or not you think Trump can deliver on what he's promising or not. But what Trump seems to be saying is he's going to end both conflicts, but in opposite ways. When it comes to Ukraine, he's simply going to negotiate with Putin and end the conflict. He's going to offer up some deal. When it comes to Israel and Palestine, he's going to turn up the pressure and break Hamas and create a situation where they can have a new negotiating partner and end the conflict much more quickly. That seems to me to be his approach to these two conflicts. Whether or not Putin is going to take any terms from Trump and that would be acceptable to the United States and to Ukraine is questionable. I don't know what that deal would be exactly.
Yeah.
And whether or not it's simply a matter of U.S. force being applied with more pressure and without any hedges would actually break Hamas is also I'm skeptical about that. I think that's the difference, that he has he was willing to be more of a diplomat with Putin, and he's going to be less diplomatic and more apply more pressure on Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah and so forth.
Because that's interesting, because it kind of links with this, with the West, the way the West has positioned itself vis-a-vis Ukraine during the summer. There's been a kind of growing skepticism towards Ukraine being able to sustain the war, and a lot of questioning about the money as well that has been given to Ukraine over the last 2 years, right, to sustain this war against Russia. And I think in the UK particularly, there's been a lot of interest around that money and that debt, fundamentally, because if you're talking about loans, the UK has obviously given a lot of aid, financial aid and military aid to Ukraine, and also there's a lot of bondholders, Ukrainian bonds that are somehow connected with the World Bank, but also with the UK economy. And I think that during the summer, there's it's been quite open, the skepticism towards the purpose of this financial help. We've seen a number of things, very interesting things. We've seen Zelensky coming to London at the end of July, I think, or towards the end of July, and I think Zelensky at that time, he was given the privilege to address Starmer's cabinet, which is a very rare occurrence. It only happened, I think, 30 years ago. I think in 1996 or 7 to Clinton. So it's he was treated with the utmost respect by, but at the same time, there was this growing doubt about Ukraine's capacity to repay the bondholders. And Finch, for example, the credit agency, lowered the credit rating for Ukraine from CC to C. And the credit rating of C is normally reserved to countries that are on the verge of defaulting, or they are already going through the process of defaulting. And obviously, Ukraine is in a very, very fragile position in terms of its economy, its debt, and potential bankruptcy. So there was a lot of fear, obviously, about these investors, from these investors, that Ukraine wouldn't be able to repay the debt, or at least the interest on the debt. There was a grace period that was agreed of 2 years, but in August this year, obviously the repayments needed to be made, at least start to be remade. So, and then we had the Kursk incursion. We had this attack that took everybody by surprise, including the Russians, into this region of Russia. that somehow convinced, I think, the bondholders that the restructuring of the Ukrainian debt could be discussed, could be negotiated. And I think it was like 2 or 3 days ago that they reached an agreement on, the bondholders and the Ukrainian government on the restructuring of that debt, a restructuring which was fairly advantageous for the Ukrainians because the debt was reduced quite substantially and prolonged into the future, so extended into the future, blah blah blah. But it's almost as if that Kursk incursion was used to convince the creditors essentially that Ukraine still is in a fairly strong position vis-a-vis Russia, whilst at the same time in the Donbas region everything was more or less collapsing, and Russia was threatening really to overthrow the Ukrainian army there. So it's been an interesting. I mean, in a sense, it's really about, once again, about the capacity of the system to continually refinance the debt, right? So this is money that has been, and so the war essentially makes sure that this debt can be refinanced again and again in the future.
I've heard that Biden's aim, or that the U.S. aim with the Ukraine, is to use the Ukrainian war as a way to put the Russian state under enough pressure so that it cracks up and can be annexed.
That was always the objective, but if you look at what's going on today, it's Europe that is cracking up. Europe is deindustrializing. Without Russian gas, it's lost all its competitiveness in industrial, which was already fairly weak. If we exclude Germany, for the rest of Europe, it was already quite weak. But now that Germany cannot use cheap Russian gas, its economy is actually not collapsing, but surely weakening. To the extent that I think it's today recent news that Volkswagen has announced the closure of 2 plants in Germany, right? Which has never happened before in the history of the company, and of course that has attracted a lot of attention and protests from the workers themselves. And I think this comes as a consequence of having to do without cheap Russian gas. Energy, as well as other things like the green transition and transition away from, the green transition, etc. But the problem for Europe is that instead of Russia, it's Europe itself that is economically decaying. Whereas Russia is growing. I mean, the growth of Russia, it's taken seemingly everybody by surprise. Although, again, I can't believe that it has, because it was pretty obvious from the very beginning that Russia wouldn't just collapse under these sanctions. In fact, Russia's got even stronger now. Its economy is growing faster than most economies in the Eurasian continent, and the sanctions have not posed any real problem for Putin. So I in a sense, I doubt that the Western leaders really believed that they could crash Russia through these sanctions and by throwing all this money and military aid and military intelligence into Ukraine. I doubt that for me, these wars are means fundamentally for credit creation, right? These wars serve the purpose of, once again, prolonging the agony of this Western capitalist system that is fundamentally based on debt. And the big problem that the West is facing, it's insurmountable mountain of debt that is growing, all the time, and that growth cannot be stopped, and that debt needs to be refinanced through other debt. So it's a self-defeating logic that however, nobody seems to have an alternative for. If you think of Europe, for example, Europe is, I think, worse off than the United States at the moment, including the UK, obviously, because of its deindustrialization without having what the United States have, which is monopoly over the currency in global terms. So Europe is really worse off. And I think the conditions of Europe, the situation, the economic conditions of Europe have worsened quite tragically since the beginning of the war in the Ukraine, with this kind of breakup of the relationship with Russia.
Well, in the United States, there has been a kind of minor attempt to onshore and reindustrialize. And the growth rate, I just looked it up. The growth rate in Russia,
4%, I think it is.
It's 2%
at the moment. I think it's 4%.
Yeah, I just looked it up. It's like well, I'm looking according to Google. It might be 4, but the charts I'm looking at, it's like 2% for Russia and 1.9 for the United States. China is 3% growth. Iran 3.8. This is maybe ending in 2022.
I think the recent data say that Russia is growing. I think it's its economy is growing very fast. Obviously from a fairly weak position, but it's growing very, very fast. And so what I'm trying to say is that the objective of these sanctions, they kind of boomeranged. They didn't really work at all against Russia. We were told that Putin would end up like Ceausescu in Romania. That would end. It would end very tragically for him. As a matter of fact, it's probably got even stronger.
Well, from the point of view of a socialist in America, it seems to me that breaking up Russia, if the U.S. policy were to succeed, that would weaken working class people in Russia. It would make things more difficult to organize politically, and it would be bad for me and for the world, for the Russian state to fall apart. And so I don't support that aim. I kind of feel as though if you take Trump at his word, which you can't do, and that the capitalist class will make promises that they can never ever keep, but the idea of making America great again, making Russia great again, making Mexico great again, that should be the aim for working class people. Like we should all be demanding work, we should be demanding productive lives and communities that function. And to wish any other country, it always strikes me as when people talk about, Chinese growth is a threat to America or something like that, it's always giving the game away that this isn't working, right? Because the idea should be the more productive other nations are, the better off everyone can be through free and equal exchange. And right, but anyhow, that's just
I think my view on that one. I think we discussed it before. I mean, it's not naive, but maybe slightly idealistic in terms of growth being less and less possible for most. I mean, my argument is that we are going through a structural crisis of capital itself, and therefore it's more and more difficult to produce economic wealth through the traditional channels. That is to say, through labor.
I totally agree. I mean, I remember that. I mean, I know why. I know why this is happening, and yet politically, when you talk, but when we see what I just want to avoid doing for all people is saying the crisis of capitalism we shouldn't take that on as our crisis, right? It's their problem. We should push and demand that the society lives up to it. Yeah. But anyhow, but no, but these things are unfolding, and I do think obviously you're quite right about Europe, and certainly the UK seems to be in a major crisis. And more totalitarian for it, right?
Well, and then there's also that. I mean, whenever you have this acceleration, this accelerated implosion, which I'm been trying to describe in my book. Now it's really accelerating. You know, that logic of capitalist implosion, which has to do with the rate of production, which has to do with the mode of production, and also the mode of social reproduction that goes with it. The fact that capital is unable to produce the wealth necessary to reproduce societies more and more. This always leads to things like social protest, right? Inevitable. So there will be more and more social protests, which also will be manipulated. People will be played one against the other, right? Especially poor people. This always happens, and I think it's going to happen more and more. I think we've seen something like that recently too in the UK with this riots between immigrants and the right after the Southport stabbing. I don't know whether you've heard of that or not, but I think that happened in back in July, and these riots went on for a little bit. At the beginning of August, but at the same time,
and that turned out not to have been done by an immigrant at all, right?
No, I mean it's a British national.
All right, you're back. I'm gonna
remove this one. When I talk about things like that, you know, something happens all the time. There must be a coincidence, but I don't believe in coincidences. So
yeah. So, but you were saying that the
I mean that again, what we had there apparently was this. I wasn't here, right? I wasn't in the country, but I was told that there were some riots and there were some. And there was a lot of, I mean, the government stepped in, and there was a crackdown on the right. You know, the right that was obviously was against attacking immigrants because they thought that the immigration was the problem in connection with the stabbing. But again, it seemed to me that there was a degree of manipulation of that conflict. Because what we actually saw was that the crackdown then almost kind of produced a sort of Orwellian outcome in terms of the police and the state stamping their authority over dissent, over critical voices, right? So it's easy now to say that somebody who is an activist for Palestine is anti-Semite or whatever, you know. So it can be criminalized for that. In the UK, we've had, I think, a guy called Richard Medhurst. I don't know whether you've heard of him as a journalist, a pro-Palestine activist, etc. Has been in detention simply because of issues, right, over what's going on in Gaza, particularly. And another journalist, I think, Sarah Wilkinson, who's also been in prison for that reason. So you see that you know, events like that can be magnified, and then the authoritarian sort of dimension of implosive capitalism can be imposed more and more on dissent, on critical voices, using the excuse that there are some sort of far right guys who are attacking immigrants. But then there's, you know, the law can be quite you know, can be used in a very authoritarian way. As a consequence. And I think we've seen that. We've had a taste of that definitely in the summer here in the UK, which doesn't really bode well. But I think it goes together with this idea of an implosive system that becomes more and more manipulated and centralized, also in terms of the authority of the state. So we've had that, and we've had also social unrest, as I said, and we've had. And of course, there's this rhetoric of war, which continues. It's unstoppable, right? I mean, they openly talk about investing in the military-industrial complex as maybe the only way in which the economy can grow, even. They've said it in the UK. Mario Draghi has said it now in I think in somewhere in Europe, that the way in which Europe can regain some kind of economic competitiveness is by investing in the military-industrial complex. So by, you know, boosting the weapons industry, which is madness, right? I mean, it's total madness. But now they say it openly. They don't have a problem with that. It's a terrifying prospect, and it's quite a depressing prospect as well, you know. And I don't even think it will necessarily work for the economy. But regardless of that, it's the idea that you've got to push wars and escalations to improve your economic conditions.
Yeah, after the economic crisis of 2008, the writing has been on the wall that the neoliberal global order was not going to endure. The EU had been in and out of crisis on and off since then, and I think the Brexit vote was kind of a reaction to that. There's been this hope amongst all the different nations that reinvesting in local sovereign economies would be what would be best for global capitalism. But with that has always been the kind of unstated but nonetheless obvious fact that there will be winners and losers as the countries turn inward, and that along the way there will be geopolitical conflict that arises over who will be the winners and who will be the losers as the economy contracts. And and everyone wants to have their own independent military industrial complex so they can make sure that they are going to be the winner and in the end. And that could be I guess, I mean, tell me if I'm crazy. Could that even mean conflict between European nations on that level eventually?
I think it can mean any kind of conflict, whether it's regional, local. Obviously, I think it's more likely to be like that. Maybe proxy wars, maybe hybrid wars, but a situation of constant tension that requires nation states to be prepared militarily for this sort of thing. But then you see that becomes the cause that causes that sort of becomes the reason why or the motive for economic investment. It's about investing into a part of the economy that is perceived as being profitable. And the fact that now everybody's saying the military is, the military industrial complex is the profitable part that remains within the capitalist system now, it's a worrying sign. But I think it goes well together. I don't even think it's particularly profitable because it requires deficit spending, right? It's not a productive economy per se. It doesn't necessarily put a lot of people into work. It destroys lives rather, right? Because ultimately you kill people with the weapons you produce. But it's not productive in traditional capitalist terms, where you put people to work so that they can consume what they produce. Right? I can work in a factory producing weapons, but I'm not necessarily going to consume weapons.
Right.
So my labor is not necessarily productive for capital. So it's an illusion that there is productivity in the military-industrial complex. It's actually an industry that works, through deficit spending. Once again, state spending that boosts that industry, but it's again not productive in capitalist terms. It's not a productive type of economy.
Let me see if I can play devil's advocate and you can knock this down.
Yeah.
Because I think you're totally right. I completely agree with you. But let's say I'm going to try to justify military industrial spending as a way to strengthen the capitalist economy overall from the position of some administrator or bureaucrat within the state. Like I would say, as we invest in high-tech military equipment and weaponry, we will be innovating the technological know-how of the nation. We'll be developing patents that we can then sell into private hands, and we can and what comes out of the military can eventually be taken up by the commercial sector. And so it will, by working through the state to develop weapons that themselves will never be used to produce commodities and grow the economy, we can nonetheless produce the technological innovation necessary to improve our productive capacity in all sectors and eventually come out to the side.
I think that's a very good story that you would sell to the people, and some people would buy it. Mm-hmm. But I think the purpose of that sort of technological advancement, etc., would be, and it is today, only to inflate the tech bubble in the financial sector. Right. So we got, if you look at the Nasdaq index, for example, it's been going up to historic heights really over the last month. It's come down a bit, obviously, recently because Nvidia suffered losses here and there, but it's still doing incredibly well. And I think that's what the war industry, insofar as it's linked to the technology industry, to high tech, artificial intelligence, etc., is ultimately boosting. It's creating the conditions for more inflation of the tech bubble. But I don't think it's, once again, we go back to that idea of productivity. Who's actually producing these weapons, machines, etc.? It's a mistake to think that you get a labor intensive production in factories like as it used to be in the 60s or 70s even, or 50s. You get machines that deliver other machines mostly, and very little human labor involved in it, and that in itself doesn't create conditions for economic growth. And on top of that, the workers who are producing and being exploited to produce weapons are not necessarily going to buy them and consume them for the benefit of the economy, the internal economy. So it's a bit of a fallacy to think that the military, like Mario Draghi says, by boosting the military industrial sectors, you create conditions for economic growth. I think it's a lie that they're selling us to justify what they're actually doing, which is to make sure that the financial sector stays inflated for as long as possible, or it deflates very, very little in order to inflate again. Because ultimately, if you look at at companies like that produce chips and involved in AI technology, etc., there's a massive difference between their economic value and their capitalization in the financial markets. The capitalization is almost grotesquely detached now from real economic conditions, the number of people that they put to work, etc., etc. So there's a massive gap between the financial wealth, produced by these assets, and the actual economic conditions of the companies themselves. There's hardly any connection anymore. There's hardly any causal logic that connects the real economy and the financial economy. So the ultimate, I think, aim is to keep these bubbles propped up, particularly the tech bubble, which is driving the sector today. And I think wars and research in technology connected with weaponry, etc., serves the purpose of propping up that bubble or keeping that bubble inflated. I think that's the main purpose of that. So there's a lot of lies and manipulation going on in that narrative of investment in that sector, sort of helping the economy.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think it does.
Well, you point out AI and as one of the things that will probably be developed by more investment in the military, right? There's all sorts of ways in which AI is used in weaponry and targeting and
think of drones, for example, right? I mean, wars are fought with drones these days. It's not like conventional wars of the past. So it's technological wars.
And but AI is only displacing workers.
Yeah,
right.
That's the thing. That's the thing. Right. Yeah. So it eliminates labor rather than absorbing labor, right? So it eliminates labor at a much faster pace than it can reabsorb it. So it's detrimental to the capitalist economy itself. which is now, that's my argument, is now reliant more and more on the financial superstructure, as it were.
In 2016, when Trump got elected, and even before, in 2010 or 11, when there was 2010, let's say, when there was a threat of Golden Dawn in Greece rising up, and which turned out to be an opportunity for Syriza, which we all know how that worked out. But there's been a thought all along since the economic crisis that this economic crisis, if the left couldn't figure out a way to organize politically to oppose the conditions that were coming out of that economic crisis, the right wing would opportunistically take advantage and have and rise up. And now I feel like I'm having real trouble distinguishing between the liberal progressives and the right wing. For instance, Starmer, arresting people for what they post online,
right?
Doesn't strike me as a liberal progressive in the way
there's
that
very little that is liberal. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And but I do wonder, do you see overall a tendency for this crisis to be turned into authoritarian, totalitarian methods of control? I mean, obviously you do.
I do.
But that's what investment in the military-industrial complexes will mean ultimately. Right?
It will mean that. It will mean also this relentless local war, regional wars. Hopefully not turning into World War III. Nuclear Armageddon, which would be But let's not even think about that, because there's nothing we can do if that happens, right? There's nothing we can do. But I don't think it's on the cards, obviously. But it can also happen as an accident and then trigger all sorts of reactions, and it can also happen without any particular willpower behind it. So, but I think the war does that. First of all, it's a classic sort of state of emergency scenario. The idea that Putin will invade Europe, for example, was at the heart of the backing of Ukraine, right? The rhetoric of Putin, and a lot of people on the left buy that too, right? That Putin is even capable of going beyond Donbass. It's difficult to imagine that he would be able to do it. And yet the nightmare scenario of Putin sort of marching to Rome and then to Portugal and conquering all of the Nazi sort of scenario, it's been very much useful for what we've seen over the last 2 years, right? But so war serves also historically also to create money out of thin air. So and for a debt-based system, that is absolutely crucial. We know now that I think maybe at the next 2 weeks, over in 2 weeks' time, more or less, we have Jerome Powell will probably announce a rate cut. We don't know whether a substantial one or just a minor one, but there should be one, because the financial sector, Wall Street, needs cheaper money, essentially, right? So it's always about at this stage, I think, where we are, it's about keeping the system liquid, making sure that there is enough liquidity in the system, because the system needs to support this mountain of bets and side bets, derivatives, etc., that need constant liquidity flows, monetary injections, precisely because they are based on leverage, on debt, and that debt needs to be renegotiated and monetized all the time. Otherwise, the whole system collapses. So I think wars play a part in this, right? In this logic of credit creation, of money creation out of nowhere, just like COVID did. And that's why I argue that COVID was also, it doesn't surprise me that COVID was also labeled as a war, right? Initially, if you remember, this is world war against the virus, blah, blah, blah. So there was a kind of militarization of society because of the virus. And that was what allowed the creation of all this money out of thin air to fight the conditions imposed by the virus. Huge amounts of money. And I think we're seeing something similar now, and we're seeing something similar with every emergency. I've noticed also this monkeypox scare, right? The WHO has declared, I think it was in mid-August or something like that, this monkeypox as being a disease of international concern, which made it sound a little bit like a pandemic, or another pandemic was in the making. So again, that plays in the hand of a system that is looking for scapegoats all the time to create emergencies, and therefore to create the need for monetary injections to keep those balloons, those bubbles inflated, fundamentally for that reason, right? And I think that's the logic that we need to look at, and it's a very difficult logic to understand, because it's quite counterintuitive, I think, and but at the same time, it's existential for the system, right? The system needs constantly to find reasons to pump more money into the system, courtesy especially of central banks. Central banks have this capacity to create money out of thin air. Now I'm looking at China. The Central Bank of China, after 2 years of not intervening in the market, has now all of a sudden bought government bonds in the Chinese market. That's something that happened just a couple of days ago, I think. Right? So it's so even in China, there's this. It tells me that even in China, there's this necessity to inject fresh liquidity into the economy, which is stalling a little bit. Right? It's not growing as fast as predicted. So the central bank needs to step in and inject liquidity. So it's what I'm trying to say is that it's a global issue. It's not just it's becoming more and more of a global issue, right? Not just for the West, but also for
China.
For China. Bank of England has just announced, I think, just a few days ago, that it will accept. So it's announced a loosening of its credit standards. So it will accept collateral that is previously regarded as being junk, meaning that it will open up to a looser monetary policy. It will be able to pump money more easily into the system. This is, and there was an interesting punchline that was used. I think, let's get ready to repo. That's what the representative of the Bank of England said in this conference, I think a few days ago. Let's get ready to repo, meaning let's get ready to loosen up the monetary policy, because the financial conditions will soon probably necessitate it, right? So basically, let's make it possible for the Bank of England to inject more money into the system in exchange for collateral that is not necessarily very good, not very high rating, but since the conditions are quite desperate, let's just exchange even, let's just buy even junk assets in order to inject liquidity into the system. So I see it as a kind of general a general weakening of financial conditions that, after the COVID monetary policy, it's now returning very, very quickly, and it affects countries throughout the world.
Well, you wanted to talk about Germany,
right?
So
the elections,
fill me in here.
Politically,
the election.
Right?
Yeah,
well,
politically, yes.
Politically, Germany. Well, first of all, the macroeconomic data are terrible for Germany, right? And I think we talked about it a little bit. I think it really is mostly as a consequence of Germany being forced to do without cheap Russian gas, essentially, right? So, and the Volkswagen incident, it's interesting because I think it really symbolizes that loss of competitiveness of Germany. Obviously, the auto industry was always at the heart of the German economy. It was able to build a surplus precisely through the auto industry, and now that Volkswagen is announcing, it's symbolic of this loss of competitiveness of the sector in Germany, and also for the rest of Europe, obviously, but especially for Germany. The elections, I think, are symptomatic of this change that is taking place within the economy of Europe, but also specifically of Germany. The elections were administrative elections in two eastern regions of Germany, Thuringia and Saxony, and the coalition of Scholz, so the Green, the Liberals, and the SPD, was defeated very heavily. Defeated by who? By the Alliance, the AfD, Alliance for Deutschland, and by the left, the Sarah Wagenknecht left, which is very much anti-system and very critical of the mainstream sort of party politics of SPD, for example. Critical in what way? Critical in terms of indiscriminate immigration. That's an interesting topic. Both the right and the left are critical of Germany's policy on immigration, and they were able to obviously to win those regional elections also on that topic. They were also very critical of Germany's aid to the Ukraine. So this kind of foreign policy that they clearly see that it caused a lot of trouble for the German economy, and therefore they opposed it. But what's interesting is that again, there's this big scare now in Europe of these anti-system parties that clearly, not only in Germany but also in France. If you think about what happened in France in the elections there, also there we had a similar situation with the right and the extreme left, if you like, finding some kind of connections in their protests against the main sort of liberal democratic parties in power. So it's happening all over Europe, and I think will continue to happen. My problem is, I think the first problem is that those in power don't want to recognize this. They just try to say, "Oh, this is just the radical far right that needs to be dealt with one way or another. We can't allow it to happen, etc., etc." That's the darkest side of Europe, and so on and so forth. But again, they kind of forget that in a democracy, that's what you get, right? In a democracy, you need to listen to the people. Otherwise, it's no longer a democracy. If you decide beforehand who should win, it's no longer a democracy.
Right.
And so the kind of traffic light coalition in Germany has suffered, quite a heavy defeat in those administrative elections there. I don't know whether they will change their policy. I doubt it. They will rather demonize those forces that have emerged now, the AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht, alliance, so left and right. But we'll do more of the same. I think that technocratic center will continue, I think, to do what it's done so far, and trying to demonize, as I said, the kind of more radical parties or the more anti-system party, more than radical. Of course, there isn't a genuine critique of capitalism there. That's the other point that needs to be made. But there is this sort of resistance against what is perceived as a self-destructive, politics that is taking place in Europe. Very much oligarchic, very much centralized. That doesn't really do anything to protect European people. In fact, it promotes the opposite. It turns Europe into a kind of deindustrialized desert that doesn't really have any role to play in world economy. Which
Europe
is really,
was supposed to be like just a running on tourism.
Yeah,
one big giant theme
I think
park.
it will probably become that. I think that's probably what's coming. It will be reduced to that, because as a consequence of a number of I think self-destructive choices, it's now completely, or it will completely being completely deindustrialized. So it won't really have a role to play any longer. And because it doesn't have, like the United States, monopoly over the currency, it will struggle. It will struggle more and more. So it's quite symptomatic what happened in Germany, but it's also symptomatic that people are realizing that something is wrong, right? Because, I mean, this is what it is. These votes are votes of protest against essentially a technocratic government that simply executes orders on behalf of another power, right? It's no longer on behalf of the people, but it's on behalf of an external power. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of self-destructive behavior going on in European politics today, and I think the Russian affair is really kind of the very fact that despite all the sanctions, Europe still cannot do without Russian gas today. So Europe is still importing more Russian gas from Gazprom than LNG from the United States, right? Than liquefied gas from the United States, because it's much more expensive, whereas it's much cheaper. So even despite the fact that it's telling the world that it's sanctioning Russia, it's still importing gas. At the same time, imagine in Germany, now it's official that the gas duct, the Nord Stream gas duct that was blown up, it's now official that it was because of it was the Ukrainians who did it, right? So now imagine the people thinking, okay, the Ukrainians blew up the gas duct, Nord Stream, which is what provided free gas for our economy, or cheap gas for our economy, and at the same time now we are giving money to the Ukrainians, right? So there's a very perverse logic there, and I think people understand that. They understand that there's something wrong in that logic. That it's the German economy that suffers, and on top of that, you send money and aid to those people who essentially caused that, that broke that relationship with Russia, that allowed you to have a competitive economy.
And ultimately, that's the fault of the United States.
Well, yes, ultimately it is. I think the aim was always to divide Russia from Europe, right? And if you look back at people wrote about this a long time ago. What's the name of that advisor to all the American presidents in the past?
Kissinger?
Brzezinski, yeah. Yes, Polish-born, I think, American, who I think wrote this book called The Great Chessboard, I think in the 1990s. And there he states very clearly that in the future, so in the 2000s, blah, 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 the US will have to try and find a way of making sure that Eurasia doesn't grow as a competitor of the United States. So dividing Russia from Europe. And he even points out Ukraine as a pivot in this, as a crucial state in which to intervene to make sure that a division is created, a break is created between Russia and Europe. So I'm under no illusion here. It's exactly I mean, one of the reasons for this war is precisely to make sure that Europe comes out much weaker.
I want to ask you about yourself, kind of, and about the left, which when I first started podcasting 15 years ago, I was starting at a time when Marxism and the far left and socialism were beginning to resuscitate themselves. Right, the Zizek had been around for a while, but he was becoming a more major figure on the world stage and taken seriously, lecturing, making movies come out about him. David Harvey is another Marxist who had his day. There and out of that there was the Occupy movement, and then there was a Sanders campaign, and overall there was a feeling amongst a certain milieu of wanting to be critical and return to Marx and return to and develop an anti-capitalist politics that might eventually have political legs. How do you feel about the way that milieu is operating now, and what I think it's not operating?
I don't see it at all any longer. Maybe there was a little bit of hope in that historical moment that you were referring to a few years back, but now I think it's completely gone. There's hardly anybody on the left that sort of dares to critique, to develop a systemic critique, of capital. There's nostalgic people. There's people who think that they can go back to the past when the working class was still a political subject, and that's some kind of contractual power, let's say, in the relationship with capital. But there's some of that, yes, but I think that's an illusion too. So I think that the left, to become really anti-capitalist, has to really reinvent itself quite radically now. It needs to think. It needs to think of other ways of opposing capital beyond, even beyond that politicization of labor as it was done in the past. I'm not saying that it should abandon labor at all. In fact, it shouldn't. I mean, the human dignity is still fundamental for the left. It should be fundamental. So it should be about defending the exploited and the poor. That's absolutely 100%. But I think what's missing is a critique of capital as a system that is now slowly but surely imploding with disastrous consequences for most of us. I don't see that at all. I see a lot of leftists like Slavoj Žižek, unfortunately, who's simply buying this narrative of deflecting all the guilt on an external agent like Putin, as if Putin is Hitler and it needs to be fought at all costs, and if we fight him, then things might get better, or we might be able to defend what we have, to protect what we have. What we have is already, from my angle, the two things cannot be separated. What we have is already going. We're already losing it, and Putin is a consequence of the fact that we have adopted this defensive strategy with regard to whatever is left, in terms of wealth creation within capitalism in the West. And so we need enemies all the time, also to deflect attention away from the fact that our system is actually crumbling.
When Zizek talked about protecting what we have, what does he think we had or have?
Well, it's the fact that he doesn't seem to understand that the West is implicated in all this, right? It seems to make that division between the enemy, Putin, and the West, as if the enemy has just come out of the sky and decided to attack us. Whereas the thing, I think we're talking about two sides of the same coin. We're all within a capitalist system that is now fighting this kind of global war with each other, amongst capitalist states, to retain some kind of access to wealth, whether it's the financial wealth of the West or maybe the more productive wealth of the BRICS countries that they think that they can still mobilize. But nevertheless, it's an intra-capitalist war. It's not the good versus the bad, and so I'm surprised when people like Zizek simply kind of refuses to develop any critique of the system as such, and of capital as such. And I think the reason is that a lot of people on the left don't have, really, it's a matter of knowledge as well, I'm not aware of how the economy works and how the economy today has been almost completely financialized. And it's on top of that, it's a debt-based system. It's a system based on increasing amounts of debt used as leverage, precisely to prop up the financial bubbles. It's not what the traditional left used to think about, but it needs to think about this as well now, because this is what the problem is, right? The problem is that the system is simply imploding on itself, and to refuse to see it is criminal for me. To refuse to acknowledge it is a big problem for the left.